June 6, 1944. 6:47 in the morning. Private First Class Johnny Martinez crouched behind a concrete barrier on Omaha Beach, seawater still dripping from his uniform, watching the horizon darken with ships. He'd been ashore for 43 minutes. Half his squad was dead. The other half was scattered somewhere in the smoke and chaos behind him. And now, through the haze of cordite and salt spray, he saw something that made him forget, just for a second, that people were trying to kill him. British landing craft, dozens of them, heading toward Gold Beach 3 miles to the east, their flags visible even through the smoke. Everyone knew the plan. The Americans would take Utah and Omaha. The British and Canadians would take Gold, Juneau, and Sword. 5 beaches, 1 invasion, the largest amphibious assault in history. Separate but coordinated. Each nation fighting its own sector, linked by strategy but divided by miles of French coastline. But this was different. This was real. Martinez had trained with maps and models, studied beach diagrams until he could draw them in his sleep. He'd memorized unit designations, tide schedules, artillery positions. He knew the British would be there, somewhere to his left, landing at their own objectives, but knowing it and seeing it. Seeing those ships cutting through the same water his landing craft had crossed an hour ago. Seeing other men heading toward their own personal versions of this nightmare. That was something else entirely. What American soldiers said when they saw British forces that morning would reveal something profound about warfare, about brotherhood forged under fire, and about the strange comfort of knowing you're not dying alone. The bombardment had started at 5:50 a.m., naval guns pounding the French coast with a sound that made thought impossible. Martinez had been in his landing craft, pressed against 30 other men, all of them trying not to vomit, trying not to think about the ramp dropping, trying not to imagine what waited beyond it. The crossing had taken 90 minutes. 90 minutes of diesel fumes and salt spray, and the sound of men praying in languages their parents had brought from the old country: Italian, Polish, Spanish, Yiddish. America compressed into a steel box, heading toward a beach most of them couldn't pronounce. When the ramp dropped at 6:35, Martinez saw 3 things simultaneously: gray water, gray sand, and gray German bunkers spitting fire. The man in front of him took 2 steps and fell. The man beside him made it 4 steps before the machine gun found him. Martinez ran. Not toward anything, just away from the killing zone at the ramp. He ran through water that grabbed at his legs, past bodies that floated face down, past equipment that would never be needed by the men who'd carried it. He'd made it to the seawall. Somehow, along with maybe 12 others from his company of 200 men. They lay there, gasping, while bullets chipped concrete inches above their heads. That's when Sergeant Frank Morrison crawled up beside him. Morrison was from Kentucky, 34 years old, which made him ancient by infantry standards. He had 3 days of stubble and eyes that had stopped registering surprise. "You see that?" Morrison pointed east toward Gold Beach. Martinez looked. Through gaps in the smoke, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of British landing craft, different from the American vessels. Lower in the water, smaller ramps, and behind them, the larger transport ships, disgorging wave after wave of troops. "They're getting the same welcome we did," Morrison said. Not with satisfaction, not with pity, just stating a fact. And Martinez realized every man in those British craft was feeling what he'd felt 20 minutes ago. The fear, the noise, the moment when the ramp drops and your life becomes a probability calculation measured in seconds. They were going through it right now. Different beach, same terror. "Wonder what they're saying about us," someone muttered. Private Eddie Kowalski from Pittsburgh. Blood running down his arm from shrapnel, but still alive, still talking. "Probably wondering why we're not moving," another voice said. That was Corporal James Washington from Alabama, one of the few black soldiers in their unit. He'd caught hell from some of the Southern boys during training, but none of that mattered now. Now there were just the living and the dead, and the categories kept shifting. 3 miles east, on Gold Beach, British soldiers were having similar thoughts. Private Arthur Jenkins of the Hampshire Regiment hit the sand at 7:25 a.m., part of the second wave. The first wave had cleared some of the obstacles, but the Germans were still fighting hard. Jenkins had trained for this moment for 18 months. He'd memorized the beach layout, practiced with live ammunition, learned to move under fire. None of it had prepared him for the reality. The noise that made his ears ring, the smell of explosives and blood, the way sand stuck to everything, uniforms, weapons, faces. His section made it to a damaged German pillbox and took cover. 10 men, all breathing hard, checking weapons, counting ammunition. Through the smoke, Jenkins could see the American beaches to the west. Omaha was still in chaos. He could see landing craft circling, unable to approach because bodies clogged the waterline. He could see smoke rising from burning vehicles. He could see, through binoculars, tiny figures hugging the sand, pinned down by machine gun fire. "Poor bastards," someone said behind him. Lance Corporal Davies, who'd been at Dunkirk, who'd seen what happened when landings went wrong. "We're not doing much better," Jenkins replied. "No," Davies agreed, "but at least we're all in it together." That phrase, "all in it together," would appear again and again in accounts written by soldiers from both nations, not in official reports. Those spoke of tactical objectives, casualty figures, equipment losses. But in letters home, in diary entries and conversations recorded years later, that phrase kept surfacing. All in it together. By 8 a.m., the situation on both beaches remained desperate but no longer hopeless. American forces on Omaha had begun to move inland slowly, paying for every yard with blood and courage. British forces on Gold had secured several strong points and were pushing through villages whose names, Le Hamel, Asnel, Vers-sur-Mer, would become permanent markers in regimental history. And the soldiers, when they had moments between surviving and advancing, began to notice each other. Sergeant Morrison's group managed to move off the seawall around 8:30. They'd found a destroyed section where German wire had been blown apart by naval gunfire. 23 men from various units, strangers an hour ago, now moving together because that's what you did. You found whoever was alive and you kept moving. They'd advanced maybe 200 yards when they encountered a forward observation officer calling in naval artillery. Captain Richard Hayes from the Naval Gunfire Support Team crouched in a shell crater with a radio operator directing fire from destroyers offshore. "Got the British on the line," Hayes said, not looking up from his maps. "They need fire support on a pillbox we can see from her. Giving them corrections now." Martinez watched Hayes relay coordinates, watched him adjust fire, watched shells from an American destroyer suppress a German position that was holding up British infantry 3 miles away. "There," Hayes said with satisfaction. "That should help them." It was a small thing, a routine fire mission, the kind that would happen hundreds of times that day, but Martinez noticed it. American guns helping British soldiers. British guns, he'd learn later, doing the same for Americans. The separation between beaches wasn't absolute. The coordination wasn't just theoretical. It was happening in real time, moment by moment, as officers made decisions and radios crackled and shells flew. By noon, both American and British forces had established precarious footholds. Omaha remained the most difficult beach, with casualties approaching 2,000 men. Gold, Juno, and Sword had progressed better, though the fighting was still intense. But the immediate terror of the landings had passed. Now came the grinding work of expanding the beachhead, of bringing up reinforcements, of preparing for the German counterattack everyone knew was coming. And in that transition from initial chaos to organized warfare, soldiers began to see each other differently. Private Martinez's group had pushed inland to a small French village called Vierville-sur-Mer. The town was destroyed. Walls collapsed, roofs caved in, streets cratered by shells. German snipers were still active, but the main defensive line had broken. Americans were clearing houses, securing crossroads, establishing positions. Around 1:30 p.m., Martinez was helping set up a casualty collection point in what had been a church when he heard voices speaking English with accents that weren't American. British accents. Posh, working class, regional variations he couldn't identify, just different from anything he'd heard in Brooklyn or basic training. A British medical team had arrived. Captain Edward Sutton and 3 medics from the Royal Army Medical Corps, attached to the 50th Infantry Division. They'd landed at Gold, pushed inland faster than expected, and now found themselves in what was technically the American sector. "Heard you had wounded," Sutton said to the American medical officer, Lieutenant David Chen from San Francisco. "Thought you might need extra hands." Chen looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "We need everything." For the next 4 hours, British and American medics worked side by side in that ruined church. They worked without discussion of nationality or tactics or whose beach was whose. They worked because there were men bleeding and they had morphine and bandages and training. A British medic held plasma while an American surgeon operated. An American medic splinted a British soldier's leg while a British surgeon dealt with a sucking chest wound on a kid from Oklahoma. Martinez watched this while helping carry stretchers. He saw how the British medics worked, efficiently, methodically, with the same exhausted professionalism as the American doctors. He saw them treat American and British wounded with the same care, the same urgency. He saw Sutton work on a German prisoner with the same attention he'd given Allied soldiers, because that's what the Geneva Conventions required, and because, as Sutton said to no one in particular, he's somebody's son too. Later, when there was a lull and both medical teams stood outside smoking cigarettes, American Lucky Strikes and British Gold Flake, both tasting equally terrible, Sutton asked Chen about the landings. "Rough," Chen said. "Omaha it was bad. Worst beach by far. We took heavy casualties." Sutton nodded. "We heard the reports. Gold and Sword went better for us, but Juno..." He paused. "The Canadians had it hard. Very hard." They stood in silence for a moment, watching smoke rise from a dozen fires across the countryside. "I trained with Canadian doctors," Chen said quietly. "Good men. Hope they made it." "So do I," Sutton replied. This exchange, brief, understated, heavy with unspoken meaning, was typical of what was happening across the landing zones. Not dramatic declarations of alliance, not speeches about unity, just recognition. Recognition that everyone had faced the same fear, paid the same price, earned the same right to be here. Sergeant Morrison had a different experience that afternoon. His group had been assigned to help secure crossroads about 2 miles inland. They dug in, established fields of fire, sent out patrols. Around 4 p.m., they heard vehicles approaching, from the east. Everyone went on alert. Could be German counterattack, could be Allied advance. Hard to tell through the hedgerows. Then Morrison saw them. British armored cars from the reconnaissance regiment, moving fast, scouts ahead of the main advance. Sherman tanks, American-made but with British crews, distinguishable by the different markings and stowage configurations. Infantry following in trucks. The British column stopped when they saw American positions. An officer dismounted, walked forward with his hands visible. Major Timothy Blackwood, commanding a squadron of the Royal Artillery. He was covered in dust, had a bandage on his left hand, looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "American sector?" he asked Morrison. "Yes, sir. 29th Infantry Division, or what's left of it." Blackwood consulted a map. "We're ahead of schedule. Pushed through from Gold faster than expected. Need to coordinate fire support and make sure we're not shooting at each other when the Germans counterattack." Morrison called for his company commander, and for the next hour, American and British officers huddled over maps, comparing positions, establishing radio frequencies, arranging for artillery coordination. It was mundane, technical, necessary work. But Morrison noticed something. The British officers didn't act surprised to find Americans here, didn't act superior or condescending, didn't act like this was unusual. They acted like it was exactly what they'd expected. Allied forces, fighting together, coordinating as they'd trained to do. "Your boys did well today," Blackwood said to Morrison before he left. "Heard Omaha was difficult, that you took heavy casualties but kept pushing. That's soldiering." Morrison didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. After the British column moved on, Private Kowalski said, "They seemed normal." "What were you expecting?" Morrison asked. "I don't know. Something different, more British." Washington laughed at that. "More British than speaking British?" "You know what I mean," Kowalski said defensively. "I just thought they'd be more formal or something. Upper class." "Some of them were," Morrison said. "Some of them sounded like they were from London slums. Some sounded like farmers, just like us. Some college boys, some factory workers, some guys from the middle of nowhere, all wearing the same uniform, all doing the same job." Martinez listened to this exchange and realized this was the first time any of them had thought about the British as individuals rather than as an abstraction. The British weren't just an allied nation marked in blue on maps. They were Sutton working on wounded men until his hands shook with exhaustion. They were Blackwood consulting maps with dust in his hair. They were tank crews and medics and infantry, all looking as tired and scared and determined as any American. Evening brought new challenges. German forces began probing Allied lines, testing for weaknesses, looking for gaps between units. The fear now was that the Germans would counterattack in force, drive a wedge between the beaches, cut Allied forces in half. Around 9 p.m., Martinez's position came under German mortar fire. Not a major attack, just harassment. A few dozen rounds that sent everyone scrambling for cover. When it stopped, Morrison got on the radio to call for counter-battery fire. The response came from a British artillery battery 4 miles to the east. "We have your position marked," a clipped British voice said over the radio. "Can you give us direction to target?" Morrison provided coordinates. 2 minutes later, British guns opened up, and the German mortars went silent. "Thanks," Morrison said into the radio. "Quite all right," the British voice replied. "Give us a shout if you need anything else." Martinez, listening from a foxhole, thought about that casual exchange. An American sergeant calling British guns. A British artillery officer responding immediately. No questions about whose sector this was or why Americans needed help. Just soldiers supporting soldiers. The same scene played out across the front that night. British infantry calling for American naval gunfire. American troops getting ammunition resupply from British trucks because their own supply lines were still clogged with damaged equipment. A British medical team evacuating American wounded because they had ambulances available. An American engineer unit helping British tankers repair a bridge because they had the right equipment. None of this appeared in the official reports. Those spoke of inter-allied cooperation in abstract terms. But for the men on the ground, it was concrete and immediate. It was a British medic who gave you morphine when you were hit. It was American artillery that suppressed the German machine gun, pinning down British infantry. It was the recognition that the man digging in 50 yards to your left, even if he talked funny and had different rations, was part of the same desperate effort to stay alive until morning. Around midnight, during a quiet moment, Morrison gathered his squad. They were down to 8 men now from the original 33 who'd left England. They sat in shell holes, smoking, checking weapons, writing letters they hoped would never have to be delivered. "What do you think of the British?" Morrison asked. The question seemed strange in that moment, but everyone understood what he meant. They'd spent years training, preparing, hearing about the alliance. Now they'd spent a day actually fighting alongside British forces. What did it mean? What had they learned? Kowalski spoke first. They bleed the same as us. More than that, Washington said. They're just as scared, just as brave, just as good at their job. That British medic, Martinez added. Sutton, he worked on our guys like they were his own. Didn't have to do that. Could have stayed with British wounded. But he came to help. And that officer, Morrison said, Blackwood. He could have been dismissive, could have acted like we were in his way. Instead, he treated us like equals, like we were both doing the same job. Isn't that what we are? Private Danny Wright asked. Wright was from Maine, quiet, thoughtful. Doing the same job? Yeah, Morrison said. I guess we are. None of them had the vocabulary to express what they were feeling. Years later, historians would write about Allied unity and coordinated operations and inter-service cooperation. But in that foxhole at midnight on D-Day, the concept was simpler and more profound. Recognition. Recognition that the British soldiers 3 miles to the east had gone through the same hell that morning, had felt the same fear, made the same sacrifices, earned the same right to be called survivors. June 7th arrived with rain, cold rain that turned foxholes into puddles and made everything harder. But the beachheads held. German counterattacks had been stopped or blunted. More troops were landing, more equipment arriving. The invasion, which had seemed so fragile at dawn on June 6th, was becoming something permanent. Martinez's unit was pulled back to the beach for reorganization and resupply. They'd lost too many men to remain combat effective. They needed replacements, rest, hot food if any existed. They walked back past the carnage of the previous day, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, the Graves registration teams doing their grim work. At the beach, Martinez saw the full scale of what they'd accomplished. Ships everywhere, stretching to the horizon. Equipment piling up on sand. Engineers building roads, laying pontoons, clearing obstacles. And British soldiers working alongside Americans, both groups looking equally exhausted, equally relieved to have survived. He watched a British engineering team helping American engineers repair a damaged pier. Watched them work without discussion, without hesitation, each doing their part because the work needed doing. He watched a British supply officer coordinating with an American quartermaster, both trying to untangle the logistics nightmare of feeding and supplying 250,000 men landed on a hostile shore. A British soldier, Jenkins, though Martinez didn't know his name, sat nearby on an ammunition crate, writing a letter. He looked up as Martinez approached. "Rough day yesterday," Jenkins said. It wasn't a question. "Rough for everyone," Martinez replied. Jenkins nodded. "I watched your beach from Gold, through binoculars. Saw what you went through. Omaha was... It looked impossible. Felt impossible," Martinez said. "Still don't know how we made it." "Same way we made it," Jenkins said. "You kept moving. That's all any of us can do." They sat in silence for a moment, watching ships unload, watching the organized chaos of the invasion's second day. "You know what I thought," Jenkins said. "When I saw you blokes landing, I thought, thank God they made it. Because if Omaha fell, if the Americans couldn't hold their beaches, we'd all be pushed back into the sea. Your success meant our success, and vice versa." "Didn't feel like success at the time," Martinez said. "Never does," Jenkins agreed. "But here we are. Here we are. 2 soldiers from different nations, sitting on a French beach, alive when so many weren't. Connected not by grand strategy or political alliance, but by shared experience. By having faced the same test and passed it, barely, at terrible cost." That afternoon, Morrison was called to a briefing for NCOs. American and British officers together, planning the next phase of operations, coordinating advances, establishing boundaries, arranging for support. Morrison watched how easily they worked together now. The formality of yesterday had dissolved into practical cooperation. They argued about tactics, debated approaches, made decisions. But they did it as colleagues, not as foreigners forced to cooperate. "We're linking up," one American colonel explained, "creating a continuous front from Utah Beach to Sword. No more separate operations. We advance together, we hold together, we supply each other as needed. National boundaries matter less than tactical effectiveness." In practice, this meant British and American units would fight side by side for the next 11 months, would share supplies when theirs ran short, would provide covering fire for each other's advances, would evacuate each other's wounded, would, slowly, learn to appreciate each other's strengths and tolerate each other's quirks. American soldiers would learn that British rations included tea and that British soldiers seemed to need it the way Americans needed coffee. British soldiers would learn that Americans had incredible logistics capabilities and would somehow get fresh donuts to the front line while British troops were still eating hardtack. Both would learn that courage and fear, competence and confusion, bravery and exhaustion looked the same regardless of accent. But all of that came later. On June 7, 1944, the lessons were simpler. Captain Sutton, the British medic who'd worked in the American casualty station, found Lieutenant Chen before pulling back to British lines. They'd worked together for hours, saved lives together, seen things neither would ever fully describe to anyone who hadn't been there. "Thank you for letting us help," Sutton said. Chen looked at him like he'd said something strange. "Thank you for coming. We needed it." "We're all in this together," Sutton said. That phrase again, simple and profound. "Yes," Chen agreed. "We are." They shook hands, a formal gesture that seemed inadequate for what they'd shared, but also exactly right. Then Sutton climbed into a jeep and headed back to his unit, and Chen returned to the continuing stream of wounded men who needed care. Martinez watched this exchange from a distance. He thought about what he'd seen in the past 36 hours. Thought about the British landing craft heading toward their own beaches while he was still pinned down on Omaha. Thought about the British medics who'd helped save American lives. Thought about the artillery that fired when called, the supplies that arrived when needed, the recognition in Jenkins' eyes when they'd talked on the beach. What did American soldiers say when they saw British forces landing on D-Day? Not much, as it turned out. There wasn't time for speeches, wasn't room for grand declarations. They were too busy surviving, too focused on the immediate task of staying alive and moving forward. But what they thought, what they felt, what they learned, that was more complicated. They learned that the British weren't abstractions or allies in name only. They were men doing the same impossible job under the same impossible conditions. They bled when hit, died when killed, kept fighting when they wanted to run, just like Americans. They learned that cooperation wasn't just something officers planned in headquarters. It was concrete and immediate. It was a British artillery battery that answered when you called. It was a medical team that came to help because they had hands and you had wounded. It was an officer consulting a map, trying to make sure you didn't shoot each other by mistake. They learned that the invasion, which looked from above like separate national operations with neat colored arrows on maps, was on the ground a more fluid, more human thing. A continuous effort by hundreds of thousands of men who happened to wear different uniforms, but who were united by the simple fact of being there, of having survived the beaches, of having earned the right to be called liberators. Private Martinez survived D-Day and fought until the end of the war. He came home to Brooklyn, worked in construction, raised 3 children. In 1984, he was interviewed for an oral history project about the invasion. Asked what he remembered about seeing British forces on D-Day, he thought for a long moment before answering. "I remember being glad they were there," he said finally. Not because of strategy or politics or any of that. Just glad. Because it meant I wasn't alone. We weren't alone. All of us going through hell together, Americans and British and Canadians. All of us scared, all of us fighting, all of us hoping we'd live to see tomorrow. He looked out the window of his small apartment at the New York skyline, at the world that had been saved, at least partly, by what had happened that day. People ask if the alliance was real, if we really worked together, and I tell them, yes, not perfectly, not always smoothly, but when it mattered, when we needed each other, we were there. The British covered our flanks. We covered theirs. That's not propaganda or politics. That's just what happened. He paused, remembering a beach 40 years gone, remembering faces of men long dead, remembering the sound of British voices over an American radio calling in fire support. "We didn't save the world alone," he said quietly. "None of us did. We saved it together, or we didn't save it at all." On Gold Beach, in a small village in England, Arthur Jenkins, now in his 60s, retired from a career as a school teacher, would have agreed completely. Asked the same question about what he remembered seeing American forces that day, he gave a similar answer. "I remember thinking, they made it. The Americans landed and held and pushed forward, which meant we could do the same, which meant the invasion might actually work. Not certain, not guaranteed. Just possible." He smiled slightly, an old man remembering his youth, remembering fear and courage mixed together. "We were all in it together," he said, using that phrase that appeared again and again in accounts from both sides. "That's not a slogan, it's just the truth. We needed each other, and when we needed each other, we came through." That was what American soldiers said and thought and learned when they saw British forces landing on D-Day. Not in words, not in speeches, but in actions and recognition and the quiet understanding that comes from shared suffering and shared purpose. They learned that the alliance wasn't just letters on a map or signatures on a document. It was British artillery answering American calls for fire. It was medical teams working together because they were wounded and they had training. It was officers coordinating across national lines because the alternative was chaos. It was soldiers recognizing in each other the same fear, the same courage, the same desperate determination to see the job through. They learned that saving the world required more than one nation, more than one army, more than one sacrifice. It required all of them, together. Not perfectly unified, not without friction or disagreement, but united by the simple fact of being there, of having landed on those beaches, of having survived that day. And on the beaches of Normandy, where grass now grows over the scars and monuments stand where men fell, that truth remains. Carved in stone, written in memory, preserved in the testimonies of those who were there. We were all in it together. That's not poetry. That's not propaganda. That's just what happened on a beach in France when the world was being saved.